I know this isn't breaking news, but we're sick and getting sicker at an alarming rate. 70+% of us are now overweight, obese, or morbidly obese. 60% of us have a chronic disease and 40% of us have more than one. Just over half of us take pharmaceuticals daily. And here's the crazy thing. We're no longer outraged or alarmed over this information. It's become our new normal. Part of the problem has to do with money. There are billions of dollars being made treating the symptoms of a chronically ill population and comparatively very little money to be made in helping people rethink and change their lifestyle for optimal health. But there's good news, great news in fact. For the most part, optimal health is within our control. We can become our own healthcare advocates. In fact, we must. By taking ownership of our health, we have the opportunity to feel better, live longer, and to mitigate the devastating consequences of chronic disease. Hello, and welcome to the Over 50 Health and Wellness Show. I'm your host, Kevin English. I'm a certified personal trainer and nutrition coach, and my mission is to help you get into the best shape of your life, no matter your age, so you can show up in the second half of your life as the healthiest, strongest, most vital version of yourself. We have a great show for you today. Emily Gold Mears is here, and she's going to help us optimize our health. But before we get to that, I want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Living Libations. It is so hard to find truly organic and natural beauty products that don't contain harsh chemicals. Even organic or natural brands often sneak in these harmful chemicals, but Living Libations has a line of pure and organic renegade beauty products that will make you look and feel your best without any of the harsh or harmful ingredients. They have a full line of beauty products for men and women that not only leave you clean, radiant, and smelling great, but all of their products actually heal and nurture your skin's natural microbiome. I personally switched over exclusively to their products about 5 years ago, and they are an important part of not just my hygiene care, but of my whole body wellness care. You can check out their full line of soap, shampoos, cleansers, oral care, deodorant, natural makeup, and so much more. Just head over to Silver Edge Partners and click on the Living Libations icon, and you can get 10% off your order when you use the coupon code SilverEdge at checkout. Again, that's silveredgepartners.com and use the coupon code SilverEdge. That's SilverEdge all together, no spaces. Okay, enough of that. Let's get on with today's show. My guest today is Emily Gold Mears. Emily is a research analyst and author of the new book, Optimizing Your Health, an approachable guide to reducing your risk of chronic disease. In today's show, Emily is going to share 18 ways that we can optimize our health and greatly reduce the risk of chronic disease. I started our conversation by asking Emily how she got interested in helping people optimize their health.
Well, I used to be a lawyer, which I did not love, but I did gain some very valuable research skills. And I do love to research, and I've always been interested in science and medicine and health. And when my father became ill, I was devastated and wanted to see if I could find anything that could help him in any way or delay the progression of his disease. And that really unleashed a torrent of new research.
Okay, so you were a lawyer by trade, so certainly you had some, I would guess, a research background. And then, as you said, when your father got ill, that kind of led you into more of, I suppose, researching medicine, health. And you describe yourself as a citizen scientist. Is that right? Talk to us about what that is and how you became a citizen scientist.
Well, as I mentioned, I've always loved science. And a citizen scientist really just defines a group of people who are emerging, who are not credentialed as actual scientists, but they are embracing the field of science. And in today's world, there's so much pseudoscience, which is often melded with marketing. It's very hard for people to distinguish between marketing and science because the two tend to overlap quite a bit. And a citizen scientist, one of the things that they do is they try and filter through all of the noise associated with that.
There certainly is a lot of marketing in our science today, and I think it's really exacerbated by just the social media and probably by our short attention spans, right? We're a culture that loves sound bites and memes, and really hard to convey, especially complex ideas and topics through that very short medium. So you talk a lot about we need to become our own healthcare advocates. Talk to us a little bit about what you mean there.
Well, I mean, that we can, we must. That's the first call to action. And the reason for that is that doctors are overworked because the insurance companies, they have a very limited time with each patient. They also don't have a lot of time to research the latest innovations, and there are many. I learned a very interesting statistic that it takes 17 years between the time something is discovered and the time it becomes mainstream. And so as an individual patient and consumer, we have to intercede, and nobody knows our body and how we respond to things better than ourselves. And we cannot put all of our healthcare decisions in the hands of a doctor.
Okay, so somebody hearing this might think, well, hang on, my doctor went to school for 8 years and would certainly know better about my health than I do. How might you address somebody's concerns along those lines?
So I would say the best approach would be to work collaboratively. Yes, they did go to school 8 years ago, but chances are it was quite some time ago, and things are changing rapidly, and they may not have had the time or the inclination to keep up with the new changes. That and the fact that we are each individuals, and this is a main theme throughout my book, that we are all different genetically, biochemically, and physiologically. And doctors tend to address health issues with a one-size-fits-all protocol. And that's not effective. They don't know how each one of us responds better than we know ourselves.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So doctors do tend to use a one-size-fits-all approach. And I suppose that's just kind of the way our medicine system works, right? And typically our healthcare system today is really good at treating symptoms, not so good at treating root cause. Why don't you talk a little bit about the difference between, say, that traditional sick care, the traditional treating of symptoms versus functional medicine practice?
So that is a good question, and it's quite a distinction. And I don't mean to demonize conventional or allopathic medicine at all, because they do wonderful things. I mean, if you are in a car accident or have a broken bone or an acute infection, you want to go straight to your conventionally trained doctor because they're very good at treating that. What they're less good at is chronic disease. And chronic disease is a big umbrella that includes many, many different diseases. And that's where they just address the symptoms. And addressing those symptoms may mask them. It usually doesn't get rid of them, but it masks them. And it doesn't get to the root cause, which logically makes better sense to figure out what is causing this dysfunction and address that.
Okay, so that's really going to get into the meat of what I want to talk to you about today. So here's a few alarming statistics, right? 60% of all American adults have a chronic disease. 40% have two or more, I believe. And that number, of course, is growing. Over half of us are on a daily dose of pharmaceuticals, I think is the way you put it in your book. And of course, most of us are overweight, obese, or morbidly obese. And I had a guest on recently who had brought up the interesting fact that while these are the statistics, and these statistics are in fact growing, this is becoming normalized. We're no longer shocked when we hear that 60% of us have a chronic disease. So talk to us a little bit about what's the underlying cause of this rampant chronic disease in our culture today.
Well, I wish there was only one cause that we could pinpoint. But unfortunately, like the diseases itself, It's multifactorial. There are so many things. Our soil is depleted of minerals and nutrients. Our food supply is tainted. Everyone has become more sedentary. And a big one is that our toxic exposure has grown exponentially. And those are just a few of the really big causes. There are many others, but those are big ones. And then when you combine all of them together, it's a perfect recipe for people to get sick.
Yeah, it certainly is. And we are doing that in record numbers. We're getting sick and we're getting sicker in spite of, having the most advanced medical technology we've ever known and certainly spending more on healthcare than ever before. So we mentioned in the intro that you're the author of the book, Optimizing Your Health, an approachable guide to reducing your risk of chronic disease. And you have this laid out very nicely in chapters going through a number of these different things that you had mentioned, right? You had talked about toxins and nutrition and some other things. But I'd like to go through some of these and just get your take on, just at a high level, how these topics can help us be our own healthcare advocate, right? And the very first one is our oral microbiome. Now, most of our listeners probably are familiar with the gut microbiome, and spoiler alert, we're going there next. But talk to us about our oral microbiome and why that might be important to us.
So your mouth is the gateway to your digestive health. And as we know, your digestive health impacts everything, and poor oral health affects the entire body. And there are a lot of chemicals in oral care products. And I chose that as the first chapter because it seemed like a good place to start.
Yeah, I guess that's a good point. That is the first place to start, right? For anything that we're putting into our bodies has to go in there first. And you had mentioned a lot of chemicals in our dental care products, and certainly that is the case, right? So before we move on, talk to us about a microbiome and what is a healthy microbiome? And let's just stay with the oral microbiome for the time being.
A healthy microbiome, whether it applies to your oral area or your gut or any other area, is when you have a homeostatic balance of bacteria. We're made of mostly bacteria. And what you ideally want is to avoid dysbiosis, which most of us do have. And dysbiosis is defined as an imbalance of good and bad bacteria.
Okay, so we want to avoid this dysbiosis, right? And what we really want is this homeostatic balance of bacteria, you said. And when we use products like, antiseptic mouthwash and these other things that have chemicals in it, is it fair to say that we are indiscriminately killing bacteria, including this very healthy bacteria that we really want in our oral health? Is that fair?
Exactly. Like when people use mouthwash, they're usually alcohol-based and it's indiscriminate. It kills everything, good and bad. Now, that also applies to all the antibacterial soap that everyone is using. You have a microbiome on your hands and you're killing all the bacteria indiscriminately once again.
Yeah, great point. So we not only do we want to maintain a healthy oral microbiome, but our skin also has a microbiome. And every time we use a antibacterial soap or some of these other products with fragrances and other phthalates and all these chemicals and things, we're really going to war with that biome. And we can't have that natural healthy biome when we're using these products. Okay, so staying with the microbiome, your second chapter is gut microbiome. Talk to us a little bit about the role of gut microbiome and avoiding chronic disease.
Well, so many interesting things have been discovered about your gut microbiome. I mean, it affects everything. It's connected to your brain through the vagus nerve, and the state of your gut, it affects your daily quality of health. Every 2 to 3 weeks, we generate an entirely new gut lining. And once again, the key is to maintain a balance of both good and bad microbes. The dysbiosis is the imbalance of the bad versus good and leads to dysfunction in not just the gut, but in all areas of your body. The foods that we eat affect the diversity of your gut microbiome, which will then affect your immune system, your central nervous system, your brain function, and your heart health. And the key, and this took me a long time to learn, as most of the lessons did, the key is a diverse diet. We don't want to eat the same thing again and again, even if it's healthy, because we need to populate our gut with different bacteria.
And that's going to lead very nicely into your next chapter, because I believe the gut microbiome, well, the gut's connected to almost all of our bodily function, but certainly it is with immunity and inflammation. So in chapter 3, you talk about immunity and inflammation. And talk to us a little bit about the role of immunity in inflammation and what we can do to bolster that.
Well, I like to use the word modify when it comes to, or modulate rather, immune system, because people talk about strengthening your immune system, and that may not always be a good idea, because we saw with COVID that when people have an overactive or too strong of an immune system, cytokines are released, and that does not have a good effect. But I discuss in the book how we have a two-part immune system. It's quite interesting. We have both the innate and the adaptive system, and the innate is what first comes into action, and it releases killer cells to attack an invader. And then the adaptive kicks in if the innate cannot complete its job. And the adaptive immune system relies on memory or B cells, or what we've learned about are antibodies. And like everything else, as we age, our cells lose function. And this is called immune senescence, the dying of our cells. And then inflammation also has two parts. There is acute inflammation, which we would die without. We must have acute inflammation. It promotes healing. When you cut yourself, all the cells come in order to aid in healing, and we need that. But the problem arises when that innate inflammation or the acute inflammation doesn't turn off. And then it becomes chronic, and that's what leads to disease.
Yeah. Okay. So we need inflammation. We often think of, you made a couple of good points there. One, on immune system, we often hear we want to boost our immune system. We want to strengthen it. Well, back to your original statement, you said we're all bio-individuals. We're all a little bit different. And so it's tough to say whether you want to boost or bolster an immune system if, in fact, you have it, for example, a hyperactive immune system. And the same with inflammation, right? Inflammation is critical. We need inflammation. So there's good inflammation and there's bad inflammation, right? So I think when we talk about bad inflammation, we're talking really about that kind of chronic inflammation. Is that correct?
Exactly.
And where is this source of chronic inflammation coming from?
It's coming from, once again, so many things. It's coming from oxidation. It's coming from our bad diet. It's coming from our bad lifestyle habits, many of which can be modified. And that's kind of the whole point. We may not be able to avoid chronic disease, but there are so many things that have been established that can, at the very least, postpone the onset. And that, I think, is the goal.
100%. Yeah. So chronic diseases are often referred to as lifestyle diseases, right? Because there are things that we can do. We can change our lifestyle and drastically change our health. So let's move on, because moving from immunity and inflammation, your next chapter is on stress. And we've talked a lot about stress on this show, but stress is kind of like immunity and inflammation, right? Stress, there's good stress and there's bad stress. Talk to us about stress and its role.
Well, exactly right. The good stress, small acute stress, is good because it creates an adaptation, or a concept that I go into in the book called hormesis, which is a really interesting concept where acute short-lived stress causes your body to adapt and then ends up making you become more resilient. So that we need. And once again, like so many of these other biological functions, the problems arise when the acute stress becomes chronic and it doesn't turn off. It's not short-lived. And that becomes truly problematic.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us, I guess our bodies were evolutionarily designed for this stress response, right? It would our fight or flight. And once upon a time, it certainly would have kept us alive. If you're gathering food and to take back to the campsite 10,000 years ago and a cave bear comes around the corner, you would want an acute stress response to help you in that situation. Unfortunately, our body doesn't know the difference between that stress and the stress from fighting with a spouse or being in traffic or an angry coworker or boss. And more of us are involved in that just day-to-day chronic stress. And that just leads to a cascade of very poor health outcomes. Is that fair?
Exactly. Very well put.
Okay. So you had referenced toxins a little bit. Your next chapter is on toxins, and they seem to be everywhere now. Talk to us about toxins.
You are exactly right. They are ubiquitous. There are over 85,000 chemicals in our food and water supply. And what's even more dangerous is the isolated chemicals, is the combination of the chemicals and their unknown effect. And they are literally in everything. They are in our air, our water, our food supply, our personal care products, our house cleaning products, everything, even in places that you wouldn't suspect. They are ubiquitous. And in my opinion, I think that they play a very large role in all of these diseases.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Toxins, and it can drive you nuts to try and remove all toxins. And to be fair, we can't, but we can control it and we can take charge of it and ownership of it. And I'd like to tell people to start in one room. Maybe it's your kitchen, maybe it's your laundry room, maybe it's your bathroom or your garage, and just start looking at some of the products that are in there. Now, in your book, at the very end of your book, you've got a great reference there for brands that people can substitute for what they're currently using, whether that's going to be laundry detergent or pots and pans or beauty products, et cetera. So I would encourage folks to check that out. There's a really good list there. You also reference the Environmental Working Group. So that's ewg.org. They have some fantastic resources there as well. But just starting in one room of your house and just making yourself familiar with the ingredients that are in those products is a great way to just start this journey of detoxing your life from these external toxins, because they are literally, like you said, they're in everything. We can't escape them. They're in your water, they're in the air, they're in your mattress and your bedding and your cookware, your Tupperware, all of your beauty products. So that's a mountain of toxins. And that's a pretty shocking number you gave. You said there's, 85,000 different chemicals now that are in our food and water supply?
Yes. And I'm sure that I back that up with a footnote. I have 200 footnotes because none of this stuff is made up. It's all backed. It's evidence-based. And what's interesting is many of the chemicals that we allow in the United States are banned in Europe and other countries.
Yeah, that's true. I've heard that several times. And to your point, there is no oversight on what the combination of these chemicals is doing to us, right? So we have a number of chemicals in our cleaning products, a number of chemicals in our water, a number of chemicals in our hygiene products. And all of these things are certainly, when taken together, if we're constantly microdosing ourselves with toxins, that's not going to lead to optimal health outcomes. It just isn't.
Exactly.
All right. So moving along, your next chapter is one of my favorite topics. It's on sleep. What is the role of sleep in our health?
Sleep is huge. It has also received short shrift in the enormous impact it can have on not just your health, but your daily life and your happiness and your productivity. And a large percentage of the population gets inadequate sleep. And this affects your cognitive function, your immune system, your vascular system, the endocrine system, and the health of our cells and our microbiome.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of us can relate to, just anecdotally, we know that feeling of waking up refreshed and ready to take on the world after that wonderful 8 hours of sleep. And we all know that crappy feeling that comes from having 4 or 5 hours of sleep. And what I'll hear oftentimes, and it's usually those kind of type A go-getters, that no, I don't need 8 hours of sleep. I do fine on 5 or 6 hours of sleep. And I would submit that no, you don't. Or that you would do much better if you had that full 8 hours of sleep, because as it turns out, some very, very wonderful things happen when we get the full complement of sleep. Specifically, we have those healthy sleep cycles, the REM and the deep sleep. Do you have any favorite tips for improving sleep health?
Yes, I do. I have a few of them. One, I think, is to sleep in a cold and a dark room, as dark as possible and as cold as you can withstand, because the temperature really affects how we fall asleep and how we remain asleep. If you get too warm, you wake up. Also, you have to reduce your blue light exposure at night, because that's been proven. If you have too much, blue light is fine during the day, but if you have too much blue light exposure at night, it enters your eye and hits your pineal gland, and it shuts off your production of melatonin. And that will interfere with restful sleep as well. And one other tip that's easy to do that makes a really big difference: if you have dysfunctional sleep, if you make a habit of in the morning, within 30 to 60 minutes of waking, if you go outside and you get some sunlight in your eyes, not directly looking at the sun. And even on a foggy day, there's sufficient photons to enter your eyes. That can reset your circadian clock and make a big difference.
Yeah, so those are a couple of great tips. Obviously, the blue light in the evening is going to affect our circadian rhythm, right? It's going to shut down that melatonin, and melatonin and cortisol are going to work together to help us keep that healthy circadian rhythm. And then I love that tip of first thing in the morning, taking that walk outside. That's got so many benefits in addition to just really resetting that circadian rhythm, that circadian clock. All right, we've referenced your next chapter several times, and we probably will some more because you can't get away from it, and that is nutrition. So I think most people know that nutrition plays a role in our health, but how important is nutrition?
I think it's huge. And by the way, just to remind your listeners, because I know so much of this is overwhelming, I learned everything by doing it the wrong way. I had terrible eating habits. And I didn't think it mattered. I happen to have been an athlete, so I burned off the food, but I didn't appreciate how important it was to eat really healthy food until I saw my father get sick. And then I began my research, and I thought no food is worth whatever pleasure it may momentarily give you to end up that sick. I don't want to do it. And as Hippocrates said, let food be thy medicine and let medicine be thy food. It turns out to probably be one of the most important things. But having said that, there's a real lack of consensus in the nutrition area of science. It is the most confusing and complicated. You can read as many studies that demonize eggs as promote eggs, and the same is true with coffee and wine and so many other things. But there are a few non-controversial subjects. That is, they're not controversial unless you include the food lobbies. But most scientists and doctors will agree that processed foods and foods with a high amount of sugar are harmful. There are no benefits to eating those foods.
100%. And I often say that while nutritional science is vastly complex, and it is, the way you eat doesn't necessarily need to be. If you just take for example, the tip you just gave, if you can greatly reduce the amount of processed food you're eating, that is, if you can eat mostly real whole food, you're so far ahead of, everything else after that is almost splitting hairs, right? If you can just eat real food. And I think we get lost a lot of times in a lot of the minutia because we got folks that are out there. When we say nutrition, a lot of people just automatically go to weight loss or they go to supplements, but really it's much simpler and more basic than that. It's just cutting out all that added sugar, vegetable oils, salt, and all the stuff that's coming in our processed foods. And really in the last 100 years, we've just had this crazy explosion of these processed foods that weren't even foods 100 years ago, right? I think that somebody 100 years ago, if they were walking to a modern supermarket, wouldn't understand what they're looking at on these shelves. And it's a scary place to be, right? Because we have PhD chemists and scientists that are creating these food substances that are hyper palatable. That meaning they're delicious. And we have these other very highly paid advertising agencies that are making these things very, very appealing to us. And then, of course, to your point, we have, of course, the food lobby in there lobbying politically. So the deck is almost stacked against us. But if we can just go back to eating whole foods, that's, I think, the very most basic step. Do you agree with that?
I completely agree. I think that if someone wanted to do one thing, they should start with dramatically reducing their sugar ingestion, because there is nobody, with the exception of the sugar lobby, that can tell you that there are any benefits from eating sugar. And there are a long list of harms.
That's a great tip, just to greatly reduce sugar, because what you're going to do there is back to what we were talking about a minute ago. You're going to greatly reduce your processed foods because almost all processed foods got added sugar. So if you flip over a package, look at the ingredients list, underneath the carbohydrates, you'll see it says added sugar. If it has a number there, put it back. And you'll be very hard pressed to eat a whole lot of processed foods because almost all of it has got added sugar. So that's a great, great tip. Okay, so obviously nutrition is key. Your next chapter is another one of my personal favorites, and that is movement. How is movement important for us in our overall health?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, our societies become far too sedentary. And as we age, we risk losing muscle mass. And that is dangerous. That leads to bone loss, which can lead to falls that can be quite devastating as we get older. And just inactivity in a sedentary life leads to health problems. So it's an important thing to keep your metabolism good and do movement. And it doesn't have to be, once again, another area that I learned the hard way. I have been a distance runner, and I'm sure that I did way too much exercise without any understanding of what I was doing to my insides and the reactive oxidative species that I was causing to develop, which causes inflammation and a host of other ills. And you don't want to over-exercise, but you don't want to under-exercise either. And it doesn't need to be Olympic caliber, but if you can just move throughout the day, get some kind of movement, even if it's gardening adds to the list of movement. But it's just important not to sit around.
Yes, it's important not to sit around. And I think specifically for my audience, those of us over 50, you had referenced that age-related muscle loss, that sarcopenia, osteopenia, the bone loss. And it's really, really critical for those of us that are aging to maintain that muscle mass. And I'll get folks sometimes, especially female clients over 50, and I'll recommend weight training. Well, I don't want to get muscle bound. That's not what I'm looking for. And well, no, A, you won't get muscle bound. And B, it is important. It's important to keep that type 2 muscle mass, right? To your point, to keep our metabolism fired up and to have that capability and that strength and that flexibility and agility and coordination and balance into later life for us to enjoy not just our quality of life, to do the things we want to do and to be active and competent and capable, but also to be healthy, to be metabolically healthy and to ward off these chronic diseases. So yeah, absolutely love that. And I tell people a lot of times when they say, what's the best form of exercise? It's the one that you'll do consistently, right? Find something that you love to do and stick with it. Lifting weights may not be for everybody, but there is a form of exercise, hopefully, that you find enjoyable or at least bearable that you can weave into the fabric of your life for the rest of your life.
Absolutely.
Yeah, love it. Absolutely love it. Okay, from there you go on. Your next chapter is on respiratory physiology. What do you mean by respiratory physiology?
Well, that's sort of a fancy word for breathing. That's all that means. But it's so important that to call it just breathing, I think people disregard it. They just assume that we automatically do it, and they don't take into consideration that most people are doing it incorrectly. And the act of respiration is defined as the metabolic process of oxygen intake and carbon dioxide release. And as we age, once again, another grim statistic, we lose lung function and lung capacity. And on average, this decline begins at around age 35. So what most people don't consider is that breathing through the mouth fails to get as much oxygen to the brain as breathing through your nose. And a lot of people are breathing through their mouth. And that causes a lot of issues, not just during the day, but at night when you sleep. If you breathe through your mouth, you're not getting oxygen to your brain, and it can result in sleep apnea and disrupted sleep.
Yeah, so I think that breathing, you're right. Most of us take that for granted. So there's a couple of different things here, right? You mentioned breathing through your nose, breathing deeply. And then there's the area of intentional breath work and going back to things like you were talking about stress and inflammation and things of that nature. Certainly those of us that live very stressful lives or are in this constant fight or flight, even just a few seconds of breath work. By breath work, I don't mean anything fancy. I mean maybe a 4-second deep inhalation, hold it for a few seconds, and then maybe a slow 8-second exhalation. That exhalation being longer than that inhalation will move us from that sympathetic into that parasympathetic, from that fight or flight into that rest and digest mode. And if more of us were more intentional with our breathing, I think we would be certainly much further down the road in terms of stress management and just overall health. But there is a lot of shallow breathing. There is a lot of mouth breathing. There's a lot of breathing dysfunction in sleep. And so certainly getting that dialed in will optimize your health.
Indeed.
So where are we going from breathing? I think your next chapter is hormones. So most of us have an idea that hormones are important. How do our hormones affect our overall optimal health?
I think that hormonal imbalance results in a variety of health issues. And there's all sorts of, there's your sex hormones of the estrogen, the three types, the estradiol, the estrone, estriol, which both men and women have, but in different amounts, testosterone, progesterone. And then there are the metabolic hormones, cortisol, insulin, and thyroid. Cortisol being a stress mediator, insulin controlling blood sugar and promoting growth, healing, and repair. And then there's the thyroid, which is the master gland of the body. And it controls and maintains metabolism, regulates body temperature and weight, and regulates energy transfer and production. And I'm a big believer in the effects that hormone imbalance can have on a person, but I would have to say that before you do anything in that regard, that's one of the areas that you must consult a healthcare practitioner. You don't want to be tinkering too much with that on your own. You need someone who's very well versed. And I suggest that you test. Before you do anything, you test first so that you can understand what your baseline is and where you need to improve, but always with the guidance of someone who truly understands hormones.
Point well taken. That is a place where you certainly want some expert guidance, that being able to test and to advise on what you do there. And certainly, as we age, we all know that our hormones change, right? And so having a trusted advisor there can go a long, long ways towards optimizing your hormones. Now, your next chapter, I was a little surprised to see this in here, and it's cold thermogenesis. So I'm familiar with this because, of course, the biohacking community is really into it. Some of the folks that I personally follow on social media are big proponents of cold thermogenesis. But talk to us about cold thermogenesis and what you mean by that.
So thermogenesis is an interesting biological process. And what it is, it's defined as the process of heat production. And then cold thermogenesis is the process of heat production resulting from cold exposure. It's interesting. If you sit in a sauna and you become very hot, what happens is then your body has to work hard to cool you down. And the opposite is true when you're in a cold plunge or a cold shower or a cold environment. Your body has to work hard to heat you up. And what this does is ends up benefiting your metabolism, your cognition, your immune system. It decreases inflammation. It helps your sleep. And it's an example of hormesis, which we discussed earlier, which is exposure to transient stress, which will then create adaptation and result in increased resilience.
Okay, so it sounds like we all want that, right? Now, for those of us listening, saying, okay, cold thermogenesis, you're talking about a cold plunge. So is that those crazy people in ice baths? How might we practically apply cold thermogenesis?
Well, there are easier ways to do it. You don't have to jump into one of those big cold ice baths, although plenty of people do. But a really somewhat easy way is there's a device which I referenced in my resource chapter called a chili pad, because there are some people who really have to cool themselves down while they sleep to improve their sleep. And what this is a device that you put under your mattress, and it keeps your body temperature at an optimum place. But a very easy, simple thing to do, which is what I do, even though I hate it, I must admit, is at the end of my shower for the last 30 seconds, I turn it to very cold. And it hasn't become any more pleasant, for me at least.
You don't get used to it, right? Yeah.
Well, some people claim that they do. I still find it unpleasant, but I think that the benefits are worth the very brief amount of unpleasantness, because you do feel very vibrant when you're done.
Yeah, you definitely feel awake and refreshed. I've played around with some of that myself. And okay, yeah, so cold thermogenesis, and the mechanism there is our body is becoming, you'd mentioned a couple of times, getting in the state of hormesis. And that's that adaptiveness that we're looking for. It's going to make us more resilient and therefore healthier. Is that the right idea?
It is. I think we've all become too comfortable. We live in a time where we live in a totally temperature controlled environment. And everything is pretty easy and comfortable for us. And it turns out that's not that great for our biology.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. We have become very, very comfortable, and especially where it comes to temperature, right? Most of us spend the majority of our time, certainly, in climate control environments. Okay, moving on. Your next chapter is on light optimization. What do you mean by light optimization?
So this is something that most people also don't pay attention to. And there's a confusing element to this in that environmentalists, and most of us, I think we want to help the environment, we're advised to use LED lights because they're more sustainable for the environment. And I suppose that's true. But the problem is they're very bad for our biology. The spectrum of light is not good for us. It has too much blue light. And to have them at night, it interferes with our biology. So I recommend that incandescents and halogen lights are much better for us. I don't know if they're okay for the environment, but in terms of our biology, we will feel better as a result. And the timing of your light exposure makes a big difference because blue light is not inherently bad. We see a lot of people wearing blue blockers all day long, which they don't need to do because blue light is okay. It's natural from the sun, the different spectrums of light and outdoors. It's at night where it becomes problematic. And that's when you want to shift to red hues. And in terms of red hues, there was an interesting story that I included in the book. In 1903, there was a Nobel Prize awarded to Niels Finsen for his use of light therapy, or what they call photobiomodulation, to treat disease. And I'm not sure why this died on the vine and hasn't received as much attention as it should. I think that it's emerging now because people are realizing that it can be quite beneficial to lowering inflammation, helping mitochondria, and other aspects of our biology. So once again, early morning light exposure, sleeping in a dark room, exposure to both blue and red lights at appropriate times, and switching your light bulbs are the actions that one can take to optimize their light exposure.
Okay, those are great tips. And I want to go back because you had referenced that red light exposure and how that seems to be, it's not new, certainly, but it does seem to be getting a little bit of traction here. There's companies like Juve and other folks that are making red light therapy. So I suppose that's also an alternative that people can look into in terms of it. I think that would probably fall here under light optimization. Now, you've referenced also blue blocker glasses several times. So are blue blocking glasses so folks that want to say, well, I'd like to watch television, or I need to be on my iPad or my phone right before bed, or I want to, I suppose, are blue blocking glasses a good way of blocking out that blue light and not inhibiting our melatonin response?
They're helpful. They're helpful in terms of if you have to be on your laptop or your phone at night, you can download a red feature that can cut down on some of the blue light exposure. And I don't know that TVs have that same option, but if you're going to watch TV at night, it is good to wear blue blockers, but with one caveat, and that is you want to source them properly because, there's a lot of charlatans out there who are selling products that may not be effective. And in my resource chapter, I think I list some trustworthy brands.
You do. Yes. Yeah. I saw those in there. Absolutely. Okay. So moving on from light optimization to hydration. I think we all know that we should stay hydrated, especially now it's getting warm out. How should we hydrate and how does that affect our optimal health?
Once again, hydration is a critical component of optimal health. And one of the main functions of water is to aid in the transmission and absorption of vitamins, minerals, and nutrients into our cells. And disease usually is a result of cell problems. When our cells begin to degrade, that's when things start to go awry. And we've all heard many times to drink 8 glasses of water, but that's just kind of an arbitrary number because it really depends upon your size, your level of activity, where in the country or the world you live, how dry it is, how humid it is, how much you sweat, how frequently you go to the bathroom. All of these things need to be included into your amount of water. And then the other thing is also make sure that you're drinking good quality water. You want to filter your water.
Absolutely. So one of the things I tell folks in terms of hydration is, and it's just a rule of thumb or a starting place, is drink half of your body weight. We're going pounds here. Drink half of your body weight in ounces, and that's at least gets you into that minimum amount of water. And many people aren't getting anywhere near that much water. And unfortunately, a lot of the liquids that they're taking in are not water, right? They're sodas, coffees, teas, energy drinks, things like that, which are doing more harm than what little good they're getting from the hydration that's in there. So yeah, great information there on hydration and the importance of hydration. So your next chapter is on fasting, and certainly fasting seems to be catching on, particularly the intermittent fasting is really popular right now. Talk to us about fasting and optimal health.
So fasting has been around for a very, very long time. It just seems to be in vogue these days, but it has been shown to trigger metabolic changes, gene expression, and a reduction in chronic disease risks. It's also an effective tool for healing, and benefits include weight loss, improved gut flora, improved blood lipid and glucose control, and overall metabolic health. The one thing I would point out, there's so many different types of fasting. There's just not eating for one day or multiple days. There's intermittent fasting, which is a term that has different definitions. I prefer the term time-restricted eating, which you can do in different ways. You can restrict your eating to windows of either 8 hours, 6 hours, 10 or 12 hours, but it should hopefully not be more than 12 hours. You should at least give your digestive processes a 12-hour rest, and you'll see some improvement with that. But the one caveat is that women have to, once again, be careful, because too much fasting can upset their hormonal balance. So it's not, even though it's in the news all over the place, it's once again not something that should be done without due diligence and thought and care.
100%. Yeah. In my coaching practice, I get asked about it all the time, but it's almost always from a weight loss. Well, I have a friend who did intermittent fasting and they lost X pounds, something along those lines, right? And, there's no magic in intermittent fasting for weight loss specifically, I don't think, other than the behavioral change. And of course, if you're eating a smaller window or restricted window of eating, you're probably eating fewer calories, and that's going to lead to, of course, some weight loss perhaps. But to your point, there's also, we've got, as long as there have been people, there's been fasting practices, more typically the prolonged fast, the day, 24-hour or multi-day fasting. But yeah, this is something that's really been popular lately. The health and fitness media has really grabbed a hold of intermittent fasting, and there's a lot of wild claims out there. But again, we're all bio-individuals, and certainly this is something that if you're interested in, you should do your research and experiment and see how that works for you. And speaking of a lot of wild claims out there, your next chapter is on supplements and supplementation. Talk to us about how supplements may or may not fit into our optimal health.
Well, this is a favorite chapter of mine. I mean, I love them all, but this one, because once again, this is an area that's quite complicated. And I made a lot of mistakes. I would read articles that would recommend a certain supplement with a certain biological benefit, and I would instantly get it. And I was up to the point of taking 50 a day until I did further research. And I thought, no, wait a minute, this might not be the best approach, because how do these supplements work synergistically? And that's something that you don't hear a lot about. During COVID, we heard everybody was recommending that people take vitamin D and zinc and a handful of supplements without regard to the individual or the dose or the impact. Zinc, for instance, is synergistic with copper. And if one takes too much zinc, they'll throw their copper balance out of whack. And you don't want to do that. And vitamin D is related to vitamin A. And so this, once again, requires a lot of due diligence and care. And one shouldn't just experiment willy-nilly without understanding the consequences. Now, having said that, I'm a believer in supplements because most of us are micronutrient deficient. And this is responsible for nearly every chronic disease. And these micronutrients include vitamins, minerals, amino acids, and essential fatty acids. And they have there's a lot of bad symptoms if you are deficient in these micronutrients. And there are, of course, soil conditions, toxin exposure, and age-related decline in our cell health that contributes to our need for supplements. But my advice is, well, first, talk to your healthcare practitioner, first and foremost, always. But I would always test before taking any new supplement because you want to know where you're deficient. Personally, I'm not a believer in a multivitamin. I know everyone recommends them, but the reason I don't agree with them is because most of the dosages are de minimis and probably won't help you anyway. And if you are already at the proper level for other vitamins included in the multivitamin, you don't want extra. So a multivitamin is another example of one size fits all. Do a blood test where your micronutrient and vitamin levels are, and then supplement according to your own personal results.
I'm 100% with you there. Yeah, absolutely. And you bring up a really good point. I think you use the example of zinc and copper being related. I know like calcium and magnesium are related. And a lot of us, we do hear the advice to take a multivitamin or take vitamin D, take zinc, take whatever, right? And to your point, I feel strongly that you should supplement only what you know you need to supplement in the right dose. And the way you do that is by doing these micronutrient tests. You can have your minerals checked. And it's never been easier to do that from home either. There's kits now that you can order online. You can do hair samples. There's even little finger prick things or stool samples. There's all different kinds of ways for us to really investigate our health and then to take action from that. But to your point, supplements are a funny thing because most of us are mineral or micronutrient deficient somewhere. The trick is, where is it? And of course, there's a number of reasons for that, right? Our modern agriculture is a big reason, the toxin load, et cetera. But figuring out where we're deficient and how we shore that up can be an important part in really optimizing our health. I absolutely love that. All right. So moving along, you now are ready to tackle genetics, epigenetics, and genomics, I believe, is the next chapter, right? So a lot of us might think that, because my parents were this way, I'm this way, it's just genetic, and it's kind of this fatalistic attitude. But there's this growing science and evidence around epigenetics as well that says, well, hold on, maybe your environment is plays more of a key role than just your genetics. Can you talk to us a little bit about the role of genetics and epigenetics?
Absolutely. So I love this area. Genetics, I think, is the future of medicine. This field identifies one's disease risk. The way that your genes interact with each other and with your environment will influence your disease risk. And people are concerned about learning this information. And I don't think they should be, because when you learn that you have genetic variants, which we all do, it doesn't mean you'll absolutely get that disease. All it's telling you is that you have a higher predisposition, and that's useful information because you can modify your lifestyle to reduce that risk. And who doesn't want to do that? That's the field of epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of how your environment and your lifestyle affects the function of your genes. So
please continue. Yeah, I'm 100% with you on that.
So once again, there's a lot I go into in the book. There are a lot of different ways to learn about this. There's a lot of the direct to consumer tests that we've all heard about, 23andMe, which I credit 23andMe for raising awareness for this field. They really are responsible for that. But if you really want to understand your genetics, I would do whole genome sequencing. And the price of that has come down exponentially. And that will give you a lot more useful and actionable information.
Okay, so it's amazing. 23andMe is, you're right, they've really moved the needle here. And now that this kind of genetic testing is becoming more and more common and more available, to your point, to folks, it's available to us to understand these things. And it behooves us to understand where we're at genetic risk, perhaps, or have a genetic predisposition, and then to use the power of epigenetics, right? The power of altering our lifestyle to ensure that we are taking the best care of ourselves we possibly can. I'm with you. That's a very exciting field right now. All right. So we've talked a little bit about this already, but your next chapter is testing and tracking.
I love this too.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a huge tester and I love devices. I test everything. I have a giant notebook that I started years ago. If I could, I would get my blood drawn every 3 to 4 weeks because I think it gives you valuable information. Now, it's not 100% definitive because it's really just a snapshot in time as to where you are at the moment of the blood draw, and it can be affected by how well you slept the night before, what you ate, what you drank, your stress level, and in a week or two, it could change. Not dramatically, but somewhat. But it's still a good area of information. And it's better than not knowing at all. And then, of course, there are a million other tests that you can do, and they're becoming more and more available to the consumer. If your doctors won't give you a script for them, there are many ways to test yourself. And a lot of them include, if you buy the tests, they include an analysis of the tests because some of them are complicated to read, and you wouldn't want to be stuck with the results that you can't make sense of. So there are platforms where you buy the test, and then you do the blood or the urine or the saliva or whatever it is, and they include an explanation of your results.
100%. And I have just recently done a few of these and have been just completely blown away. So you can order a kit very affordably online, send in your sample, and then the way Emily's describing, you actually get a consultation. Usually it's like a 30, 40-minute consultation with somebody an expert to go over those results with you and help you make sense of it, as opposed to, okay, here's the normal range and here's your range, which is useful information, but it's only so useful. Having somebody actually take the time and talk to you about what that means, why that might be that way, and what lifestyle changes or other things you might do to positively affect that is amazing. And there are now consumer tests for darn near everything. So yeah, definitely do your research. Feel free to reach out to me as well. I'd love to tell you some of my personal experiences with some of these folks, but I think that's an exciting side of medicine now that we can really, because we started out at the very beginning of this talking about taking ownership of our health. And that's a great way to do that, right? Is to test and test and test. And then we also have all of these, we have the Oura rings, of course, Apple Watches and Fitbits and Whoop bands and all these different devices that measure our sleep and our steps and our heart rate variability. They're measuring our REM and deep sleep. So we've got all of this information that we can start to take in and as a health consumer and start really taking ownership of our health. So it's a wonderful time to be alive if you like to nerd out on that sort of thing. Absolutely love it.
Which I do. I love to nerd out.
Yes. What you do.
And one should know that these devices, you can't rely on them 100%. I don't know that they're 100% accurate, but they'll give you an idea. And the other thing that they do that I think is quite valuable is they'll affect your behavior. Because if you get into the habit of looking at the results from your Oura ring or your continuous glucose monitor, any of these devices, what it does is it makes you more aware and more conscious, and it helps to change behavior, which is probably the trickiest part of all of this.
100%. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And I think also another thing, because to your point, when my Whoop band says that I got an hour and 20 minutes of REM sleep, maybe I did, maybe I didn't. Now, there are other kits. I personally have used the Wesper kit, which is more medical grade type things. But really what I like to look at, say a Whoop band, or if you're using a Fitbit or something like that, is just for the trends. So you can start to see trends as well, or your continuous glucose monitor. And that, I think that technology, while it's maybe not clinical grade, it's like you said, it's enough to help you start to get some ideas, make some baselines, look at some trends, and then ultimately, ideally, to change your behavior for the better, for being healthy, right?
Exactly. And the other thing that it does is you referenced the results of tests. You look at the range, normal range, but I have a big problem with that because who's normal? Who indeed is normal? And what is that? Whoever made up that normal range have to do with each of us individually. And so if you do this yourself, you get to understand what's normal for you. And that's really the only compelling factor.
Yeah, those normal ranges, some of those are a little scary. They're not. Those normal ranges oftentimes are based on the quote unquote normal, which is the general population, which at the very top of the show, we talked about is getting sicker and sicker and sicker. So those normal ranges are moving into that sicker and sicker range. And you don't want to be in that. You want to be, we're trying to optimize our health here. So yeah, you want to be really careful on a lot of those tests where they're having quote unquote normal range, especially if you're towards the bottom of an already pretty low bar. Okay, so we're getting close to the end here. I think one of your last chapters is clinical studies. What can we learn from clinical studies as a layperson to help optimize our health?
So that was just sort of evidence of my nerdiness. I love clinical studies and I read a lot of them, and they're considered to be the gold standard, except for as I was reading them and thinking about them, I realized they're not quite as good as they're cracked up to be. And we don't have a lot else to go by. But the problem with clinical studies that everyone needs to be aware of, everyone who's going to take the time to read them, is they're not as foolproof and dependable as one would hope. And the reason for that is you have to find out who sponsored the study, because they pay money for this. And you have to find out who are the participants in the study. Are they sick? Are they, there are so many variables that are involved in these studies. And then, unfortunately, what I learned, it was quite discouraging, but a lot of the results are manipulated. Some of the bad results and the negative results are hidden and not exposed, and they're manipulated. So they're not as reliable as one would hope that they could be. But for now, I don't know what else we have to rely on. But that was just a little sort of an interesting concept that I thought was worth talking about.
Right. Yeah. And I'm with you on that as well. I mean, it can be pretty frustrating for those of us reading clinical studies and academic research is difficult, but also to your point, it seems so contradictory. Whenever I see a headline that says in popular media, it says new study shows or new study says, immediately I think to myself, no, it doesn't. It doesn't show that, or at least it probably doesn't. And I think you had referenced earlier, if somebody said, hey, you shouldn't eat eggs or you should eat eggs, we could both of us go and get a half a dozen studies to support our argument on both sides of that. And so that can be a little bit frustrating. But to your point, the science it's the best thing we have. It's the best tool we have to move us. Science isn't the truth. It's the tool we want to use to uncover the truth. And it's a continuous evolving thing. So the best we can do is just kind of keep up with things and see how all of this, how it makes sense to us, right? What is impactful for us positively. All right. And then you close out this book. We've referenced this a couple of times. You have a wonderful resource section. So you've got resources on basically, we went through, 16, 17, 18 different topics there, ways that you can improve your health and take ownership. And you have resources for all of those things. And if I'm not mistaken, you're not commercially connected to any of those. Is that correct?
Exactly. I'm not selling anything. I'm not affiliated with anybody. I'm merely a consumer who is trying to share the information that I have learned.
Wonderful. So, folks, I'll drop the book and, of course, all of Emily's information into the show notes here. And that book, again, is Optimize Your Health, an approachable guide to reducing your risk of chronic disease by Emily Gold Mears. That's Mears. And again, I'll put a link to that. It's available anywhere you want to buy it, and Amazon and whatnot. Emily, as we're wrapping up here, what's on the horizon for you? What's next?
Well, right now, I'm just promoting the book. I mean, my true passion is research and writing, but I have to promote the book because I spent a lot of time on it. And my objective is simply to share all this information that I learned, because a lot of the information I go into is free or low cost. And so there's no incentive. There's no financial incentive for business communities to release this information, and people need to know. And that's my objective, just to share the information and hope that people will take at least little steps to improve their health.
Yeah, you bring up a good point there. There's a quote in your book. It says, due to a lack of potential profit, the business community lacks financial incentive to promote these simple methods of health optimization. And I actually wrote that down in my show notes here because it really hit home. And when you think about it, there's this medical industrial complex really, it profits from sick people. And it's not an evil, I don't believe it's an evil cabal where there's there's these old men somewhere wringing their hands with glee that we're all sick, but there's just this financial reality that has grown up around us all being sick. And it's just a very scary, unhealthy place to be. But when you start talking about things like, hey, let's take care of our oral microbiome and our gut microbiome, let's reduce our stress and our toxin load, let's improve our sleep, our nutrition, our movement, let's think about our respiration, our hormones, and let's explore things like cold thermogenesis and light optimization. Let's, for goodness sakes, let's at least make sure that we're well hydrated, and let's take a look at where we might need supplements and where we might not. I think that you're right, that there really isn't a financial incentive for big pharma, big agribusiness, big healthcare to really promote these other than lip service, right? Because it's a good PR thing to do. Oh, you should eat healthy and you should exercise, which you should. But I think that what you've put together here is this very well-rounded, holistic approach to taking charge of our own health, optimizing our own health, to your point, in a very low cost, or even in many cases, no cost way. So thank you very much for putting this wonderful resource together. So if folks want to learn more about you and your work, how can they connect with you?
Well, I have a website, Emily Gold Mears, and Instagram and Facebook, same name. And that would be the best way.
Okay, folks, again, I'll drop all that into the show notes here. Emily, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your wisdom and your knowledge and your passion with us. And I wish you all the best in all your future endeavors.
Thank you, Kevin. I really enjoyed talking with you.
Okay, folks, that's our show for this week. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. You can find all the links to the resources we discussed in this episode over at silveredgefitness.com/episode 122, and you can continue the conversation over there as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments on today's show. I also want to let you know that if you've enjoyed this podcast, I have other free resources over at silveredgefree.com. I just recently added a guide on optimizing your metabolism, and that's been pretty popular. And just last week, I added a guide to help you get your first pull-up in 6 weeks. So feel free to head over there and download anything that looks useful to you in your health and wellness journey. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today. And until next time, stay strong.